Good morning, everyone. This is Christina Tuchico with the OCAT TA team. Thank you for making the time today to attend today's webinar on using conflict to enhance rapport and strengthen outcomes during an OCAT appraisal. Our webinar today is led by my colleague, Jennifer Shapiro. As caseworkers know only too well, conflict brought about by misunderstandings or different opinions can be a very common occurrence during the workday. While unresolved conflict can be damaging, today's presentation will discuss strategies caseworkers can use to ensure that conflict doesn't get in the way of a healthy and effective client-caseworker relationship. Jennifer is a training manager with ICF, and she specializes in developing and delivering training on topics pertaining to case management, rapport building, communication techniques, and life circumstances that interfere with family stabilization and long-term employment. In her prior work with the Colorado Department of Human Services, she helped develop and deliver coaching training for Colorado TANF case managers and workforce coaches. Her career has included a variety of roles focused on enhancing family well-being through the administration of federal and state-funded programs. Next slide. As always, we want to hear your thoughts, your strategies, and challenges in using conflict resolution during the OCAT appraisal process. Please don't be shy with sharing your knowledge and questions. Next slide. We will use several polls throughout the presentation, which you can respond to by clicking on the radio button next to your preferred response. Just a reminder, the May 4th webinar will be a repeat of today's presentation. Also, the materials from today's presentation, including the recording, will be posted on the Learning Center. With that, I will turn it over to Jennifer. Jennifer?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Christina, for the introduction and for having me today on the webinar. Just a brief moment, we wanted to talk about what we're going to cover for today's webinar. So we are going to define conflict and share some common areas of conflict. We're going to recognize different ways to handle conflict and identify effective conflict resolution strategies. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about how customer circumstances may actually affect conflict. And that's a picture of me, but Christina's already done my bio, so we will move on to understanding conflict. So through both personal and professional lessons learned, I have experienced just how difficult and harmful conflict can be. I've also come to appreciate that for the sake of our personal and professional relationships, as well as our own mental and physical health, we must learn how to navigate conflict in a healthy and effective way. All that said, as many of you are aware, that is regularly easier said than done. So let's start first by defining conflict. Let's talk a little bit about what it is and it is not. Now, given that synonyms for conflict include tug of war, battle, and war, it is no wonder that most of us dread conflict and associate it with something where someone wins and someone loses. However, if we actually take a closer look at the Merriam-Webster definition, conflict is simply the competitive or opposing action of incompatibles that may be due to divergent ideas, interests, or persons. Notice it doesn't say anything about whether someone must win or lose, be right or wrong. Conflict is merely the existence of opposing viewpoints. Unfortunately, as many of us have experienced, when conflict is unresolved, which means it's avoided or handled poorly, it creates barriers to collaboration and cooperation. When it is mismanaged, it can be very harmful to our relationships, leading to withdrawal, resentment, and mistrust. If the customer views their relationship with you or your colleagues in this way, it will carry over into their interactions with anyone within your agency, not just the one person in which they have unhealthy conflict. If we are preoccupied with conflict or engaged in a cycle of unresolved conflict, it also negatively impacts our ability to focus at work, efficiently problem solve and resolve other issues, and it decreases our overall productivity. So as we know, conflict is stressful. Unresolved conflict, however, can become toxic, negatively impacting our mental, emotional, and physical health, as well as the other person's health. So now we are going to do a quick polling question. Please enter your responses in the question box. And we'll give you a few minutes to participate. The polling question is, what topics or situations may elicit conflict? And I'm going to take just a second to let people respond. Okay, politics. Oh my goodness, especially in this climate. That's a great response. Let's see. And we have asking about barriers, absolutely, and we're going to get to that a little bit later about how certain topics within the assessment might naturally elicit conflict. All right. Religion, yes. A few people put religion. Financial issues, oh my goodness, financial issues can really cause conflict. Oh, asking about an absent parent, or really the involvement of the other parent, whether they're absent or not. That includes pregnancy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at some point. These are great responses. So thank you to everybody who responded, and there will be opportunities for additional polling questions throughout the webinar. So now let's talk about common areas of conflict. And you guys have already done a fantastic job of kind of transitioning us into this topic with some of the examples that you provided. So first, it's really important to understand that we really, anything has the potential to create conflict, right? So you can have two people together that have opposing religious views, and there could be no conflict in their discussion. You could have two people together that have similar religious views, and yet a lot of conflict. So it's really less about the topic and more about poor communication skills, or a high charge of emotion related to the topic. So again, anything has...
Jennifer, I'm
yes.
sorry, Jennifer, to interrupt you. I think you might have paused your screen. We can't see it right now.
Oh.
After the poll question didn't come back up.
Oh. Mm-mm. Oh, there we go.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that, everyone. All right, so fortunately I didn't get into the bullets yet. So what fuels or escalates conflict is poor communication, which can easily occur when there are opposing opinions. Also power struggles, and so I think one example that was provided was in regards to parenting styles. That can create some power struggles. Ego or pride is threatened. If there are performance issues, that seems to be a really natural area. And when I say performance issues, that's not just between supervisor and worker, but even program compliance around what the customer is being asked to do. And then, of course, differing priorities and values, and this kind of speaks to the religious examples and political examples that were given. So an example may be that the program requires something that conflicts with the customer's priority of securing affordable quality childcare first. So to elaborate a little bit more, if I have children, my priority may not be go straight to work if my children are then going to be in subpar, unsafe, or questionable childcare arrangements. And so I may have a priority to find quality, affordable childcare first before participating in work activities. And then a bad day. We all understand how a bad day and stress has the potential to make every typically small thing even much bigger than usual, which can result in conflict. So with that, we actually have another polling question. And please, again, use the, I believe I said, it's the question box. So please enter your response to, during your interactions with customers, what topic areas or specific questions in the OCAT tool tend to elicit conflict? And some of you have already typed in an answer to the other, but I would be curious to see what other responses we can get. So I'm going to give you guys, all right, these are great. Yes. So anything related to domestic violence, domestic abuse, substance use, mental health, parenting when children are in foster care. I can imagine that's quite touchy. Legal issues, including a lack of driver's license, AOD, a death in the family. All right, I think we've participation requirements in program components, and then other personal issues. Custody issues, mental and emotional health. Yes, these are great responses. All right, so, and what a perfect transition to kind of talk a little bit more about the OCAT tool. So, in our quest to better understand client circumstances through a comprehensive assessment, in order to better assist them in removing potential barriers to long-term employment, we are faced with asking sensitive questions that may elicit a defensive response and leave the client questioning why it's really any of your business. So here are a few examples of areas in the OCAT tool that may elicit an unpleasant reaction or create conflict within the client. So as many of you mentioned, the domestic abuse questions. Of course, anything related to substance use, if it's a current problem or a prior problem in which they hold a lot of shame or trauma. And if you'll notice, one common theme with a lot of these questions, including emotional and mental health, is that still in this society, there is a lot of stigma around having any of these issues, and this misperception of you're choosing to have this issue and an oversimplified explanation of people should just stop or leave the situation. And so our customers may generate a lot of shame or and as well trauma that leaves them a little bit more sensitive to conflict around the topic. So to help prepare the client mentally for the sensitive questions and reduce their potential defensive responses, we recommend you provide a disclaimer to the client prior to any questions you think may be perceived as sensitive or intrusive. So for example, a disclaimer might be, I'm about to ask you several questions that may seem very personal. The reason I'm asking these questions is to determine which resources and services we can provide that will help you achieve your goals. And so it's very important to tie an explanation and justification for the questions you're answering to how the information may actually help you help them in achieving their goals. So, we have a decent understanding of what topics may lead to conflict both personally and professionally, including while conducting an OCAT appraisal. So now let's look at how we typically handle conflict poorly. Okay, so we're now more aware of the different potential triggers for conflict. Let's talk about what typically happens when conflict occurs. So many of us tend to take an immediate either-or mindset, meaning that we operate from a belief that we must make our point, get our way, be right, protect our pride, etc. And this kind of goes back to when we were talking about synonyms for conflict earlier. A lot of it had to do with battle, war, and tug of war. And so that speaks to an either-or mindset. Then once we're aggravated, because, well, the other person doesn't agree with our viewpoint, we tend to then let our emotions drive the discussions rather than taking a step back, checking our emotions in order to be more objective and logical about the conversation. We also tend to make a grave mistake and assume that whatever story our mind has created about the conflict and why it exists is actually the only true and accurate story. Unfortunately, when this occurs, we tend to deploy unhelpful tactics like blaming the other person, accusing them of malicious intent, and negatively interpreting most of what they do or say from that point forward. Meanwhile, our brain kicks in and responds to stress the only way it knows how to, by sending adrenaline surging through our body, pushing us into a fight back, avoid the other person, or just shut down response, also known as fight, flight, or freeze. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the unhelpful responses that we may occasionally do because we don't know how to do it differently, or just it's a bad habit that we need to break. So when we feel overwhelmed by conflict or defensive, we may actually withdraw or refuse to discuss the other person's needs. In our defensiveness, we may exhibit anger and lash out with resentful remarks, sarcasm, criticisms, or hurtful comments. If we feel threatened by the conflict, we may actually blame others, make threats to get our way, or reject them. Many of us have had such negative, unproductive experiences with conflict that we may actually succumb to our fear of conflict and expect negative outcomes, so thereby avoiding conflict at all costs, despite its debilitating toll on our health, our well-being, and our happiness. Now that we've reviewed how we sometimes handle conflict poorly, let's take a closer look at a few additional considerations of why we may handle conflict poorly. So remember that anger often overshadows deeper feelings of hurt, disappointment, fear, or a sense of injustice. If we can observe the anger and ask thought-provoking questions about potential underlying feelings, we will more quickly unearth what's really behind the conflict. So for example, with a customer, you might say or observe, it seems like you might be frustrated, but also discouraged that you're struggling to meet program requirements. Unfortunately, when our brain responds to perceived stress, it automatically triggers a fight, flight, freeze response that dumps stress hormones like adrenaline into our body. The brain's response to stress makes it extremely difficult for us to engage our prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for logic and problem solving. So the better we can actually control our emotions and remain calm, the better we can communicate our needs and wants and expectations without becoming defensive, frightened, or overwhelmed. So knowing that, it's also critically important that when we observe this occurring in our customers, we remain as calm, neutral, and objective as possible so that they hopefully can de-escalate and get to a place where they're actively engaging their prefrontal cortex. With the diminished ability to regulate our emotions and remain objective and stay calm, it's no wonder that when we are under stress, there is a higher likelihood of conflict. So I believe and then one very, very important point that I think we all know, but just to reiterate, living in poverty in and of itself is stressful. And then when you layer on the day-to-day logistics of managing their family and work activities and all the things that life requires, we're just piling onto the stress. So it's really no wonder that our customers may be a little bit more heightened around triggered for conflict. Okay, so now we're moving on to a polling question. So again, please use the question box and answer, what are some beliefs that people hold about conflict? I'll give you a few minutes to start typing in your responses. Conflict is personal, it's bad. Must avoid it. Oh, if you don't agree, then perhaps you don't understand. It doesn't end well. It's always negative. It often results in anger, a sense of helplessness and powerlessness. That you'll be judged. Sometimes there's cultural implications of how we handle conflict. These are great responses. Nicely done. Thank you so much. All right, so I think we have a pretty good understanding, either hypothetically or personally, of why sometimes we may avoid conflict and our ingrained beliefs about conflict. And so I like to remind people, we typically learn not just conflict, but in general, how to interact in relationships from our upbringing. And so depending on what we learned or what our customers have learned, it has become a habit, an ingrained process for how they interact, communicate, and resolve conflict. It doesn't mean that it can't change. However, it is something to be mindful of. So I've talked a little bit about adopting or about the either or mindset that gets us in trouble. Now I want us to shift a little bit into how do we shift that mindset so that it's more of a positive mindset. So although it's understandable that we have ingrained negative beliefs and experiences related to conflict, if we can adopt a more positive mindset, despite the discomfort that conflict can create, we will actually find ourselves better able to more effectively resolve it. So a general rule of thumb is that if it is important enough for someone to get upset and conflict ensues, then it is actually important enough to explore and resolve. So as I mentioned before, truly seek to understand the other person's perspective, values, and motivations related to the conflict. In doing so, you'll gain a better understanding of their deeper needs and how you can work together to help them address those needs. More often than not, we tend to come at conflict by needing to make sure that the other person understands us first. And in doing so, we actually send a message that we don't care about the other person's perspective. The result of that is we also don't seek to understand the other person's perspective so that we can actually find common ground and areas of agreement to then build on and move forward towards conflict resolution. So it's important to remember that when done well, conflict can be an opportunity to build rapport, deepen our relationships, meet each other's most important needs, practice healthy communication skills, and model effective conflict resolutions for others, including our customers who may have never seen it modeled in a healthy way before. So now that we've discussed how we might handle conflict poorly and the role of adopting a positive mindset, let's dive into specific tools for navigating conflict effectively. In addition to reframing your mindset about conflict into a more positive mindset, when we learn to practice healthy and effective communication as part of a daily habit, we actually minimize conflict. As we mentioned before, conflict often arises when there is a different viewpoint. Sometimes we may not actually have very different viewpoints, but we have the perception that our viewpoints are different due to miscommunication. So for example, you might have observed in a staff meeting before, or even between a worker and a customer, where it seems like they're actually both saying the exact same thing and in agreement, but they're using different terms or semantics, and they're arguing about it. And that's actually more common than not. So if you are discussing someone's performance, avoid beating around the bush, and actually I'm going to back up just a little bit, to help reduce those opportunities for misunderstandings. It's helpful to practice communication that is clear, concise, accurate, and timely. So for example, if you're discussing someone's performance, avoid beating around the bush, or long run-on sentences, or waiting weeks or months after the issue began. Instead, if you need to write it down, I am a big advocate of write down your key points so that you feel confident in how you're approaching the topic, and be very clear about what your observation is, what your concern is about your observation, and then asking them for input in regards to why that observation is occurring, what information are you missing as part of your observation so that you're feeling more of the story in a complete manner, and then making sure that you're doing that in a timely way. So a side note about accuracy, it's imperative that you only share facts, things that are verifiable, and if multiple people observed them, they would come to similar conclusions. It is not helpful to assume your perception or interpretation of what you observed is accurate and then push that onto someone else. So for example, telling someone you obviously don't care because you missed your appointment will likely lead to conflict, rather than simply saying, what prevented you from keeping your appointment? The fact is they missed their appointment. You are now providing them the opportunity to explain why it happened without your perceived notions or judgments about that behavior. So now we're going to take a moment to do a quick refresher on effective communication skills. Here are some key qualities possessed by great listeners. They actively listen with the goal of truly trying to understand the other person's perspective and avoid allowing their thoughts to wander. This is much easier said than done, but my joke typically when I'm teaching communication skills is that when someone is talking about hopefully anything, but definitely an important topic, really not the best time to think about what you're going to cook for dinner. So try really, really hard to re-engage your brain to focus and not wander so that you're reading between the lines and you're picking up on the subtle cues of the message that the speaker is trying to deliver. It's also important to ensure you understand what the speaker is sharing and avoid misunderstandings that can arise from assuming you understand. Great listeners regularly check in with the speaker and paraphrase what they said or ask for clarification. Paraphrasing is also a great tool to help the speaker feel like you are genuinely interested in what they have to say. Typically, when people feel heard and valued, it actually goes a long way towards conflict resolution. And then expressing empathy should not be confused with agreeing with them or identifying with their concerns or their challenges, and definitely not sharing common past experiences with the client. Expressing empathy simply means to do your best to imagine what it might be like to experience their life circumstances. And then refrain from assumptions, and that includes interrupting to finish a sentence, tuning out because you assume you know what they're about to say or why, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, Stephen Covey really explains that too often we seek to be understood rather than seeking to understand others. And I think the more we try to genuinely seek to understand, that will be a first big step in our conflict resolution. Now, let's talk a little bit more about effective speakers. Before we talked about great listeners, let's talk a little bit about effective speakers. Conflict can often arise from confusion regarding expectations. So you want to share your expectations, including program requirements, any decisions or next steps, while also expressing your interest in the customer's success and explaining how meeting expectations will lead to their success. It's critical to focus on the problem, not the person. While it can feel very personal to be on the receiving end of someone else's frustrations, disappointment, and anger, the more you can depersonalize it, the better you'll be able to work in partnership with the client to get to the root of the problem and then problem solve together in order to move forward. It's very important you stick to observations and facts, again, without adding your interpretation of those events. And then, this seems pretty simple, but often, again, easier said than done. We all make mistakes. However, sometimes we admit them, and at other times we try to make it someone else's fault. We find every excuse under the book to be defensive about, well, I wouldn't have done X if you hadn't have done Y. And so being mindful that at the end of the day, we are each responsible for our actions, how we think about things, and our feelings. It's important to take ownership of the mistakes that we may make along the way. So if we admit them, it can help de-escalate conflict and actually build trust and repair the relationship. Finally, ask questions that are designed to foster self-reflection and digging deeper into the root of the issue. Effective speakers avoid asking questions that put people on the defense by implying that their opinions or decisions are being judged or questioned. For example, these are not helpful questions. What were you thinking? Why would you do that? Didn't you know that? Etc. And I always say try to avoid why, because for some reason asking someone why naturally puts them on the defense. Finally, remember the importance of positive effect of being respectful. So I talked a little bit about the importance of questions. Here are some thought-provoking questions related to conflict. These examples can help you dig deeper and open dialogue in a non-threatening way. It's helpful to preempt questions with why you're even asking. For example, so we can figure this out together. Can you help me understand what bothers you most about this? Notice none of these questions begin with why. There's something about that that really triggers defensiveness in many people. So when possible, try very, very hard to refrain from starting questions about people's behavior with why. Some of the questions listed on the screen include what about this is most important to you. This gets at why they may be prioritizing things differently than you think. What am I missing? That gets to helping them fill in the details of the story regarding the situation. What do you think would be helpful? This is great about either how can I support you or how can we move forward so that you can be in compliance with the program requirements, get the support you need, etc. And what do you need to feel comfortable moving on? This may be simply bringing a close to an argument, a defensive thing. Mostly, okay, I feel like we've talked about this. I feel like I understand where you're coming from. Do you feel like we're ready to move on? What do you need to feel comfortable moving on in this conversation? We've practiced effective communication skills. We've done our best to regulate our response to the situation, but conflict still ensues. So now what do we do? Remembering that conflict is inevitable and serves as a great opportunity to deepen relationships and meet each other's needs. Once you're in the throes of conflict, these are a few ways to help de-escalate the situation. So I've said a few times, stay calm. Escalation leads to conflict. When we're angry, we stop listening to understand, and instead we only pay attention for the purpose of forming our own opinion and arguing with the other person. Also, be objective and remain non-judgmental, which requires self-monitoring your own thoughts and responses to be aware of when you may be judging or reacting to what the client shares. So instead, listen, paraphrase, and empathize with customer circumstances. Remember that we are each the experts of our own life, and we tend to only share with others what we want to share and only to the extent we think others need to know. Furthermore, we make decisions for our life based on our available resources and what we think is best. Our clients are no different. The more we can proceed with curiosity, laying aside our own beliefs, judgments, or perspectives, the more we create a safe space for others to share their needs, wants, and expectations without fear of repercussion or conflict. This one is really important. Agree when you can. Often we engage in arguments and we're so bent out on being defensive and arguing that we miss the opportunities to agree and find common ground. Don't argue for the sake of arguing and truly pick your battles. Accentuate the positive and agree where you can in order to help establish that common ground. In the moment, I challenge you to ask yourself, is it more important to be right or to have a good relationship that leads to positive outcomes for your program and the customer? And finally, set limits. If nothing is working or it turns abusive, obviously set limits by walking away, getting a supervisor, and or rescheduling the appointment. You can do this by calmly stating something like, I can tell this is very important to you, and I'd like to better understand how I might be able to help. However, for now, I think it makes sense to schedule a time to discuss this later when we can both think clearly and work together. And then ask yourself, how might I be contributing to this conflict based on everything we've covered in this webinar so far? And with that, I want to talk a little bit about some resources before we open it up to a Q&A session. So if you haven't already started asking questions, I encourage you to please type them in the question box, and we will track them and follow them. And as soon as I'm done sharing related reading and additional resources, we will dive right into some of your questions. Okay, so related reading. If you haven't had the chance to read these books, I highly recommend them. It will enhance your conflict resolution toolbox. These books focus on strengthening your communication and conflict resolution skills. The Crucial Conversation Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High is actually an easy and quick read that includes very concrete concepts for understanding and navigating conflict. There's also The Discomfort Zone, How Leaders Turn Difficult Conversations into Breakthroughs. And while it talks about leaders and probably speaks more to a supervisor-worker role, it's really genuinely applicable to any relationship in which you want to resolve conflict effectively. And then getting to yes, negotiating agreement without giving in. And so when you have concerns about the customer that needs to adhere to program requirements and you're having challenges, it might be helpful to have a tool like negotiating agreement without giving in and helping you figure out how to navigate that a little bit more effectively. And additional resources. So in addition to the training available to you through the OCAT Learning Center, the Conflict Resolution Network offers free training materials and self-study guides that you can use and share with customers. Their 12 skills approach is designed to run problems through a list of skills to move toward resolution, or at least improve management of the issue. So that's some very hands-on concrete tools. The company behind the Crucial Conversations book is called Vital Smarts, and they have a lot of different training and resources available to help improve dialogue, enhance accountability, improve performance, and influence change. And then finally, the Mediation Training Institute actually provides resources for leadership on the hidden financial cost of a specific issue by evaluating 9 cost factors, and offers an online instrument that looks at the conflict management strategies currently embedded in your organization. So this is a great organizational assessment tool around conflict to help shift the culture a little bit. This website also has resources for managing conflict effectively, building one's capacity to bounce back from conflict, and others resources that are more geared towards the individual. All right, so with that, we are going to enter the Q&A portion of our webinar.
Okay, Jennifer, we've got a couple questions that have come in. So the first one is a very good, very relevant question. How do you deal with clients that are willing to use anger as a tool to keep from engaging with you?
That's a great question, and it's obviously a defensive mechanism, and one that we kind of briefly touched on. And I think what's really important, there's 2 aspects to the way I want to answer this. One is sometimes we just need to call out the white elephant in the room and talk about how, while you can be sympathetic to their frustration, it's not helpful in getting us through the process. And so what would be more helpful is if you could, or if we could, I try using we as much as possible, if we could have a conversation that was a little bit more calmer and objective. So one, I think, is directly head-on, talking about what you're observing. I've noticed you tend to get really frustrated. Some people get defensive by the use of anger. Frustrated in these meetings. Can you help me understand what's going on? Okay, thank you for helping me understand what's going on. Now, let me tell you what I see happening as a result of the frustration. We're not able to get through our agenda. I'm not able to help you. It seems like there's roadblocks to getting you closer to your success, whatever it is. And then how can we work together to change that in our meetings going forward? So I think that's one approach directly with the participant. And then I also want to circle back to, if it's abusive, I encourage you to look to supervisors, peers, colleagues on their recommendations also as far as how to handle that situation, so that you're making sure that if it's just frustration, then you're engaging with the customer in an effective manner. If it starts crossing boundaries and leads into more abusive, then you have a strategy in place of how to address that.
And Jennifer, another participant had kind of a tag-on question of that. What are some of the, you talked about clients who have started becoming abusive. What are some of the signals or indicators, signs that a caseworker can pick up on that a client has kind of crossed that line, they become kind of quote-unquote abusive?
That's a great question. I think, you know, an analogy would be domestic violence relationships. It can be subjective. And is it a single incident, or is it a pattern of behaviors? And so I think one aspect to answering that question is each individual has their own level of comfort around yelling, name-calling, blaming, etc. And while I personally discourage all of that, it's going to be up to the individual worker first what their level of comfort is. The other part is it's going to be the level of skills and confidence that the worker feels they have in order to address that. So I may be comfortable with yelling or whatever, but I may actually be lacking confidence and skills on what to do next with that. And so first is where are your boundaries around how someone is responding? What is your level of comfort and skills and confidence in responding to that? And when I say skills, I include depersonalizing, your ability to maintain objectivity, things like that. And then there are probably, and I think checking in with your supervisors and your organizational culture to see how they might define this, I presume there are some pretty straightforward, clear-cut responses. So obviously anything physical is automatically crossing the line. Threats are crossing the line. Inappropriate language could be crossing the line, as well as name calling. So I think those are a little bit more clear areas of maybe crossing the line, but the other areas can be a little bit more subjective. And so I think maybe taking those pieces into account, assessing yourself, and then having a conversation with your direct supervisor around helping you clarify what those key points are where you are going to go get a supervisor or reschedule a meeting.
Thanks, Jennifer. So somewhat related questions. We've talked about strategies to use if a client is becoming abusive or using anger, but what about kind of on the opposite end? Someone asked about how do you get customers to answer questions when they have shut down or withdrawn from the question? So they're kind of, again, on the other end of the spectrum there.
And you know what, interestingly enough, it's actually a very similar response in that you want to call out what you're observing. And so to kind of walk everybody through it one more time, I think how I would approach it would be, hey, I'm noticing that you seem to be distracted or uninterested in answering these questions. Can you tell me more about what's going on for you right now? So that's that thought-provoking question where you're opening it up and inviting them to kind of share their story. Then once they share, step 3 is, thank you so much for sharing. Let me tell you basically kind of my perspective of how this might negatively impact our ability to create your case plan, move you towards your goals, or help me be supportive of you. If I don't understand the full picture of what's happening for you, I can't do my best to connect you to appropriate services and resources.
Thanks so much. And I think that's all of our questions for now. Why don't we give folks just a few seconds to make sure there's not one last lingering question. Okay. Nicole, if you want to go ahead and advance the slide. I can advance the slide too, maybe.
I was about to say, I advanced it.
Oh, perfect. Okay, folks. Well, Jennifer, thanks so much for presenting on this topic. Very informative, much appreciated. And for folks on the call, thanks so much for taking the time to take part in this presentation. Before you jump off, we just have a really, as always, a really quick evaluation. So you can let us know what you thought. That should jump to a poll.
I think the poll may not launch until it ends, but people are putting their responses in the question box right now.
And actually entering in the question box is just fine. We'll get the same kind of data. And with that, we'll give folks a few minutes just to enter their eval responses and any other kind of final comments. But again, everyone, Jennifer and all our participants, thanks again so much.
Thank you.